All right. I'm Dan Vasgird, and I think I know probably about 3/4 of you. And for the others, hopefully, maybe at the end, come up and we'll chat a little bit and get to know each other. I'm going to talk about, this is a little out of order, I apologize. John Name stepped in at the last minute last week because I was called away last week. So I'm normally the person who goes first. And the proverbial I owe John one, so for this. But we're going to talk today about history, a little bit more enhanced. I looked at John's slide, so I know he did some of the history on terms of research protections, but we're going to expand on that a bit and touch on a few other things that are not normally touched on, but in clinical research are enormously important. You'll see it, I think you'll grasp me why I'm saying that once we get into it. Guidance and the framework. I'm a social psychologist by training, so really trying to set the framework for good clinical research means more to me than just having an understanding of laboratory settings or regulations or understanding of what phase 1, 2, 3 is. It's broader than that. It's also having yourself an understanding of what science is, what science does, and what we're aiming at in this field that we all endeavor in and participate in. I'm going to talk a little bit about informed consent. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time with that, but I will spend a bit. And we'll talk a little bit about safety and also, although I don't think I'm going to have to do so much of that because I think Ali is going to do that. Dr. Karshanis is going to touch on that more comprehensively in a couple of sessions down the line. One of the things I am going to talk about today, though, that is not really focused on in some of the other sessions, is recruiting. So we're going to spend a little bit more time than usual, than I would usually do in an intro session on that. So, with that in mind, let's move ourselves along. Let's start here with the essential dilemma, the dilemma that we all have to deal with when we're talking about research participation. Why has the framework that we have, why is the world that we live in right now in terms of the broader fields of research and also in clinical research, why does it stand where it is? Why do we have the protections, the regulations on the like? This scale was not chosen from the word assemblage and for really without a little bit of thought to it. This right here, in terms of the balancing on the side, talks about the imbalance or refers to the imbalance that we're talking about up here, human dignity and social justice in an economically, politically unbalanced world. In terms of research, who would you think is here on the heavy side and who's on the light side? Who has power?
We're hoping the subject's straight.
Well, that's a good one. Well, yeah, but when it all starts out at the beginning of the game, let's say just going back in time, you're hoping that the subjects have themselves. But really, up here, anybody else? Huh?
People with money.
People with money, yeah. Well, that's part of it. Okay.
Government.
Huh?
Government.
Yeah, government, exactly. Okay, the government has itself resources. There's the FDA, of course, and just HHS more broadly. NSF is participating in other research, DOD, all of that. The government has enormous amounts of resources. There are nonprofits that have themselves resources. There are, of course, pharma that has itself enormous resources. These are the funding agencies. The research institutions where the research takes place. Here we are, right here, has enormous resources and an enormous power also. Even the researchers themselves have themselves resources available too. On the other side of the coin, at least as we're talking about today, on this imbalance side is what you were talking about. These are the subjects, participants. And really until the last couple of decades, there just wasn't anything available until you get into the really mid-1970s, and then you start to see things perk up when people start paying attention to providing a balance here. I pulled about a year ago. I was looking for I had a talk prepared, but I was looking for a hook really to use with an audience, and I think that this really does give us I like it because it helps to give an understanding of what we're trying to do in science. The exploration dynamic, this is from the National Geographic, just about 1 year ago, maybe 1.5 years ago, their 125th anniversary special. The title was called Why We Explore, but the lead article was Why We Explore, the exploration dynamic. Here's a little quote from that to kind of set the scene here. No other mammal moves around like we do, says Svante Pabo of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. We jump borders, we push into new territory, even when we have resources where we are. Other animals don't do this, other humans either. Neanderthals were around for hundreds of thousands of years, but they never spread around the world. They were very much concentrated in the lower regions of Europe, somewhat into the existing Middle East, and a little bit in North Africa, but they pretty much stayed situated for the hundreds of thousands of years that they were on this earth. But human beings, first, at least current genetics, or anthropological genetics says that human beings first came on the face of this earth in sub-Saharan Africa about 250,000 years ago. But about 50,000 years ago, boom, an explosion starts happening, start moving out of sub-Saharan Africa and move to all far reaches of the world. And then within about 10,000 years, we've reached just about every part of the world. And there's a kind of madness to it. Sailing out into the ocean, you have no idea what's on the other side, and now we go to Mars, we never stop. And why? What is this? I mean, this is our nature, us pushing ourselves. There's one explanation for this called restless, some people call it restless genes, and refer to it. And it says the exploration dynamic has arisen in Homo sapiens. Its foundation lies in our genome structure in the form of a DRD4, or more precisely the DRD4 7R, and which has dopamine, controls dopamine, important to learning and reward, pushes us, tied to curiosity, restlessness, just keeps pushing us forward. It's the part of the genome that we find that's responsible for risk-taking, ingenuity, and there are those that have the 7R trait within them, especially, and we find people who are very creative and thrill seekers and the like, which have that 7R, that especially will be pushing themselves out and trying to reach new thrills. We have skydivers, people wing divers, and all kinds of things. We also have scientists that are not hesitant to take the leap and to push themselves into new terrain because they feel a compulsion to do it. Creativity, then. This is a famous quote from Karl Marx. Free conscious activity is the human species character. He wrote that when he was about 27 years old. He was writing he just finished his PhD, and he was kind of writing a letter to himself, and it became known as the early manuscripts of 1844, and he's starting to say, what do I do with the rest of my life? Well, he gets about 50 pages into it. He's only going to write a short note to himself, and he ends up being about 140 pages. But in the middle of it, he has this one defining tone. It becomes really as he put it, it becomes kind of the defining admonition for the rest of his life. And free conscious activity, what he is saying is curiosity. This burst is really what we're all about. Our minds are what we're all about. He ends up dedicating himself the rest of his life to trying to create a social, political, economic systems that will allow people to flourish and to be able to have enough security so that they can use that mind to be creative and to expand and the like. Gerald Cohen, a couple about 20 years ago, wrote, humans are creative in the condition of freedom conferred by material plenty. That's kind of an extension of what Marx was talking about there. And then in the last couple of years, Alan Wood wrote, historical progress consists fundamentally in the growth of people's abilities to shape and control the world about them. This is the most basic way in which they develop and express their human essence. This leads on to science. And this is kind of a little premise that we're going to just refer back to, if you wish, for today. Science and the global public can be seen in a contract relationship. The world wants scientists to flourish, and the global public has more trust in scientists. We'll come back to that a little bit later, too, than any other professional category. So we move on, and humans, for the most part, then, are restless seekers. Scientists are their trailblazers. The world, the public wants scientists to help us to get out in front of issues that are problematic for us, to develop more security. Research flourishes when the public supports it, and that goes without saying. So the global public bestows on science the pathway responsibility for hope as it relates to the extended future. And hope really is something tangible, and there's a whole field that's dedicated to hope theory and centered around that. Therefore, every effort must be made to bolster the invaluable commodities in science of respect, truth, and trust. All right, so we have to push, and this becomes ingrained. So you can see how this is leading into what I'm going to be talking about today. That's the framework that we should always keep in mind about why what we're doing, and why we're doing it. Randy Cohen, he wrote the ethics column in the New York Times for about 20 years. In one of his columns, I just pulled this out. Individual ethical behavior is likelier to flourish in a just society, so in order to lead an ethical life, one should work for a just society. That is, if most of us will behave about as well as our neighbors, it's incumbent upon us to create a decent neighborhood. Our neighborhood is here. This is our university. This is science is really our neighborhood also. And so it really is important for us to take that very, very seriously. I was an IRB chair for 10 plus years in New York City. And I had a joint appointment at Columbia in the New York City Department of Health. I was in the School of Public Health there. And I used to, and this carryover from my social psychology days, when we had our meetings, we would always start the meeting, and I would remind the IRB members about the importance to become the subject as much as possible. There's a term for it in social psychology, the dramaturgical function. You try to be the other person, kind of put yourself into their mind, and plant yourself so that you can understand or empathize with that individual. Your decisions should be made with that kind of empathy inside of yourself. It is also incumbent, upon you, and to understand that you are people. As soon as you close the doors in an IRB conference room, you become the advocate, the sole advocate, in a way, for these individuals, for these participants. And of course, they're supposed to be their own advocates too, and we hope that investigators and staff and all of that too, but you become a kind of a primary advocate for them in terms of your wisdom, your experience, and the like. So become the subject as much as possible. It's something to keep very, very much in mind. And I'm talking about us and becoming the subject. That leads to an implication, or leads to the understanding that we are alike. And in essence, and I pulled this out from National Geographic's The Human Family Tree. This is just a little 3-minute excerpt. But it refers to race, but it can refer to any number of other categories that we have too.
Like all of our other physical differences, the genetic changes responsible for our varying shades of color are minuscule. Just a handful of mutations out of the more than 3 billion letters in the human genome form the foundation for humanity's entire notion of race. Tangible proof of something Dave and his girlfriend Michelle are into.
Race is just, it doesn't really mean much. I mean, people are different, but I don't base anything on a person's race.
For all problems race has caused, our differences are little, not more than skin deep. Genetically speaking, race does not exist.
A short clip. I recommend, I got a copy of that a couple of years ago, and I recommend for you to sit down and watch it sometime. It's you can also get it on Netflix, and if any of you subscribe to Netflix, you can watch it. It's about an hour and a half long, and it's an update on the genographic project that's been going on for a few years. But it's applying, I'm trying to touch on a point there about the similarities that we have as human beings. And for us to understand that, and to understand when we do research, we have to understand that we're doing it for everyone. And science should have that comprehensive global goal in mind also. The research protection system, one we're going to talk a little bit more about, and that John has referred to too, and revolves around mutual trust and responsibility, and that means for all participants. The subjects themselves, the IRBs, the research administrators, the PIs, everyone, the funding agencies, we all revolve around this kind of axis of mutual trust and responsibility. It's an implied thing. When it gets broken down, then the system itself breaks down. Alvin Weinberg, a few years ago, wrote this, and he wrote this essay, and I think it was Public Science, if I remember correctly. And this is a quip from it. It talks about that of all the traits which qualify scientists for citizenship in the Republic of Science, I would put a sense of responsibility as a scientist at the very top. He can be brilliant, imaginative, clever with his hands, profound, broad, narrow, but you're not much unless you are responsible. And he would go on to say that for people who don't have responsibility and don't have integrity and that they can't even be called a scientist. For those that would think that there are shortcuts or whatever, Weinberg would say that you are not having a good understanding of what it means to be a scientist. It is a baseline and a foundational element for the scientist. So let's start going on to human research protections before we start into the historical framework. Just a couple of things here to set the scene. Here at WVU, any human subjects research conducted by or under the auspices of any WVU faculty, student, or staff using our facilities or data or accessing WVU staff, patients, or students must be reviewed by the IRB. We were having a discussion about this the other day, Jonathan and myself, and somebody wants to come to us and they want to use a data set that we have. This is this is an identified data set. It has to go through the IRB. If it's an unidentified, an anonymous data set, that's the kind of thing that can be, and that's why you have open exchanges. But it has to fit within the 18 categories of the HIPAA identification categories. You can find those on our SOPs. I think it's about page 140 or something like that, if I remember. And they have the 18. I mean, there are things like name, address, phone number, social security, and it goes on date of birth and the like. So everything must be submitted. And if it's if it's our staff that are doing research at another institution or with the person in another institution, that still has to be reviewed by the IRB, or at least has to be told by the IRB. There's a mechanism that we use called an interinstitutional authorization agreement. If it's a multi-site trial, which means that you would pick, or you would, if all the institutions involved, 10 institutions say, and they all have FWAs, federal-wide authorizations, and that means that we can defer to a lead institution so you don't have multiple IRB review. That was a rule that came in about 20 years ago. We're also working on a process right now. There's an entity called IRB Share. It's out of Vanderbilt University, and we are signing up for that. There's I think 56 universities now that are signed up for it, and what it will do is kind of relieve the paperwork that was involved with the IAA. If we're all signed up for this, it means that for multi-site trials and that if we belong to IRB Share and all the institutions do, you just can spring into action. And there's an acknowledgement that whoever the PI is acknowledged lead. So it simplifies things quite a bit. So all of this, if it has anything to do, real long story short, with human research then it has to be at least looked at by the IRB. Even if it is something that, if you're questionable, if somebody's doing something like crowd research, which is normally not human subjects research, if you have any questions, or if it's a little bit vague because you think maybe people can be identified or whatever, call the office and we'll help you with it to classify it. IRB responsibilities. The IRB must report promptly to institutional officials, agencies, funding agencies, any injuries or other unanticipated problems, serious or continuing noncompliance, and any suspension or termination of IRB approval for research. We have very, very few terminations. I probably in my career, I have about 25 years in this field in research ethics, research integrity, and I'm probably even more than that now. I think I've probably had about 7 or 8 terminations. You really have to do something egregious to get yourself terminated. So, it just doesn't happen very often. More regularly, if it would be a suspension, that would still be very severe, but then we would work with the individual to rein it back in and to get it going again. Usually there are other ways, though, of working with individuals on things. The authority of the IRB, and again, I'm sure that John went over all of this, but just to recoup, requirement review, approve, disapprove, modify, conduct continuing review. By the way, the IRB can show up in a lab or at wherever in a site at any time. It can happen if there's some kind of for-cause issue. Quite tell you the truth, if the IRB was called, probably 1 or 2 individuals from the IRB would be assigned to go out to visit the lab or the site. Observe, verify changes, suspend, or terminate approval. Levels of review, just referred to NHSR, not human subjects research. It's usually anonymous, stuff like crowd control parades, things like that might fit into that category. There's an exemption, an anonymity category within exempt. Surveys, things like that that are low risk fall within exempt categories. They usually take a couple of days to get reviewed and approved in our office. Expedited review is a little bit higher, where it is more substantially higher risk, and that can be done by a single IRB member, and a recommendation for approval can be done. Then it's reported to the board each month. However, all clinical research has to go through a full board review, and without exception. But there are other things that go through full board review too. There can, one to stand. For instance, a couple of years ago, I had when I was chairing the IRB, we had one that was called Child Survivors of Suicide. It wasn't a clinical study; it was a study of children. It was a psychology study of children who had survived, not their own attempted suicide, but survived an immediate family member or somebody, a significant person within their family who had committed suicide, and it was a study really on how children were affected. It was aimed at trying to find treatment techniques, which there were very, very few at the time, but that's the kind of thing that would have to go to the full board also, since it's very high, not being clinical, but it would still have to go to the full board because of the risk involved. Points to keep in mind here, these are just a short list that I see that pop up all the time. One of the reasons I wanted to have a handout today, because this was really aimed at people here at WVU. It's really seems to be happened more often when you have residents, they're first-year residents, for instance, that are coming through. They might be working on a clinical trial. They're in for a 3-month rotation, and they come in and out, and they're not aware of what they're supposed to be doing oftentimes, or a new administrator, or somebody really new and just doesn't understand what their responsibilities are. There's a reminder here, keep the protocols, consents up to date, and who's involved in the study. If they leave, you got to notify us with an amendment. Amendments are very, very easy to do. Am I saying right, Jonathan? It can be as short as a little, what?
There's an amendment form in the system, so if you ever create an amendment, then you just fill out the amendment form and submit it to us.
It's probably the most simple form we have. And you just type a few sentences into it to make, and we'll get it. It's one way to keep us informed if somebody leaves the study and somebody else comes in, make sure that we're informed of that. Persons consenting a subject, they need to be on the protocol in the consent form. That's a common mistake that happens, and it can nullify the consent. We had a study that was done about a year or 2 years ago, and they were using consent forms that were, I don't know, probably, sometimes you can have 30 versions of a consent form if it's a long clinical study. And they were using something like version 8, and it was all the way up to 25, and they ended up having, none of those were usable because they were using the outdated form. They had just pulled a blank from a paper file and didn't realize that they needed to have the thing that it needed to be stamped and shown that it was up to date. Long story short, I had to go back and reconsent over 40 individuals who were spread around West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Kentucky. And it really was a logistical nightmare because they wanted the data. So it became a really tough situation. So don't let it happen. Other than signatures, don't write on the consent. That's, again, one of those things we found. There's always, sometimes to just cut corners or something, make a note to yourself, and you write on something you might find on the file. Just don't do that. Don't cross out or white out things. To make changes in it. Protocol termination by the board for serious is unusual, as I was just talking about, just discussed. You must do what the protocol says you will do. And there is now, we're starting a process in which we're going to be looking at the grant application and comparing it with the protocol, and to which we still do in very complex cases, just to make sure that there's a consistency. Make sure that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. Amendment and continuing review process of the opportunities to make the changes. So let's get into this intro to things I think you'll find somewhat interesting, and the history of research gone awry. I'm going to talk about, first, let's start with everybody's BMF here, and I put the picture of Hitler up here because coming through the gates of Brandenburg Gate, and here because he personally gave his blessing to a lot of the medical research that was done in the concentration camps, and the like. This is just, and there were a number of photos I could have pulled in and put up here. This was at Dachau, and that shows this is a prisoner, and there's water cube, or excuse me, ice cubes here. And the individual is wrapped in a protection device, supposedly, and it was aimed at what they said, it was researching to try to find a better device for pilots that were coming down in the North Sea, shot down in the North Sea, survival jackets. The individuals were tied, of course, and they did, and they were kept in the freezing water until they succumbed, and then they were. Well, whatever. These were the kinds of things that they were doing, pressurization tests, all kinds of things that they were doing. It's an example. This is the medical component, really, of the Nuremberg trial. Nuremberg trials, historically, people have heard about it. And there was a whole section that was devoted to doctors, nurses, and people who were involved in the medical trials, or the medical pieces. And this went on for about 6 months. It ended up with the Nuremberg Code. And I know that this has already been referred to. It's primarily remembered, though, for the first of the principles. Voluntary consent of the subject is absolutely essential. And that's where everything starts, from a regulatory, getting it all written down. We had nothing that really had we didn't have these ethical principles set out until Nuremberg. One of the things, though, one of the problems with Nuremberg is that it was resisted in terms of, because they wanted to codify it here in the United States. There was enormous pushback from the American biomedical research community And the main argument was that that type of research was done by bad Nazis and it could never be done. Anything like that could never be done here. And that's from about 1947 until 1972 that seemed to hold water. So there, again, there was no rule that one had to follow the code. It was just for us. There were countries that did codify, but it wasn't something that we legislated here. As the time was wearing on, though, and things started piling up, the public's getting more serious and more demanding as things started to start happening. You've heard about the thalidomide tragedy, I'm sure, but there's something that's very, very significant about it from the aspects of clinical research. Everybody heard about thalidomide, knows about the problems related to pregnant women. It went through stage. It was from 1957 until 1962. 1957, there was a researcher in Germany that introduced thalidomide, said that there were no adverse effects from it whatsoever. That was kind of standard operating procedure in Europe and to some degree here in the United States for about 3 or 4 years. The tragedy, though, that surrounds thalidomide, and I'm talking about Francis Kelsey in a second, I'm going to just read an excerpt here, was to approve the drug helped to motivate profound changes in the FDA. So it wasn't just with Tuskegee or with these other things, it really wasn't just with the National Research Act that we started seeing the first important legislation in the United States. It's really a misconception related to research. The Kefauver-Harris Drug Amendments Act in 1962 found that legislators, they tightened restrictions surrounding surveillance and approval process for drugs to be sold in the U.S., requiring that manufacturers prove they are both safe and effective before they are marketed. Enormously important, especially from your standpoint, if you're involved in clinical research. Even more important, really, I would say, even than the National Research Act. Let me read from here. In July of 1962, President John Kennedy and the American press, there's an extra, that article is referred to in the link right there if you want to pull it up, began praising their heroine, FDA Inspector Francis Kelsey, who prevented the drug's approval within the United States, despite pressure from the pharmaceutical companies and FDA supervisors. Kelsey felt the application for thalidomide contained incomplete and insufficient data on its safety and effectiveness. Among her concerns was lack of data indicating whether the drug could cross the placenta, which provides nourishment to a developing fetus. She was also concerned that there were not yet any results available from U.S. clinical trials of the drug. Even if these data were available, however, they may not have been entirely reliable. It was a very, very loose clinical research structure that we had up to that time. At the time, clinical trials did not require FDA approval, nor were they subject to oversight. The quote-unquote clinical trials of thalidomide involved distributing more than 2.5 million tablets of thalidomide to approximately 20,000 patients across the United States. Just approximately 3,700 women of childbearing age, at least 207 of whom were pregnant. More than 1,000 physicians participated in these, again, quote, trials, but few tracked their patients after dispensing the drug. They just put it out there and didn't get the results back, which kind of defies, wants to understand why they were doing it then. So the tragedy surrounding thalidomide and Kelsey's wise refusal to approve the drug helped motivate profound changes in the FDA. By passing the Kefauver Drug Amendment Act in '62, legislators tightened restrictions surrounding the surveillance and approval process for drugs to be sold in the United States, requiring that manufacturers prove they are both safe and effective before they are marketed. So the existing regulations that we have in terms of clinical trial or clinical research go back to this act. And it's an important one, really, that I would suggest strongly that you go back and take a look at if you want to have a good historical foundation. Now, moving on, in 1963, it was discovered that Bert Blatt was the guy that was most significant. He went on and became the head or the chair of the Department of Special Education at Syracuse University, and later on became the dean of the School of Education. But he discovered at Willowbrook State School on Staten Island, when I lived in New York City, by the way, I lived on Staten Island about a mile from where Willowbrook was. Willowbrook is now the College of Staten Island's CUNY campus. And what happened there is that it had been around for about 100 years. But in 1956, they implemented rules that stated that children who were severely physically challenged or mentally challenged, this is an institution that people would bring their children who were so classified and would have them institutionalized. People could not allow, or they weren't allowed to enroll their children in the school unless the school or the institution was allowed to infect the children with hepatitis A. It caused an enormous outcry when it was discovered, and as you can well imagine, it was one of those that just rippled across the United States in terms of newspaper editorials, television, radio at the time. It reaches the boiling point, to say the least. And then a couple of years later, we have the discovery that at the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital, the JCDH, was, as it says here, Dr. Chester Salpham was the driver of a study that injected live cancer cells into unknowing, debilitated patients in the 60s. Salpham and his partners decided to avoid the phobia and ignorance that surrounds the word cancer by telling patients they were getting human cells growing in test tubes. This, when it was discovered, and it was discovered by one of the people, I guess it was one of the, tell you the truth, it was one of the lab administrators, and who blew the whistle on it, and then when it was discovered, this caused another huge earthquake-type ripple across the United States. And again, this is one of the, and more things are happening over time, and the public is starting to build up this wariness about research and how it's being implemented. Now we get into Tuskegee, Guatemala. I just put this right here as a picture to give any. This was drawn from a photograph related to, or photo repository related to research that was done in Guatemala. The reason I refer to that is John Cutler, who is known as the person who really carried Tuskegee, you might say, from I think he joined the Public Health Service in 1942, and for the last 30 years of the Tuskegee study, he was the person who was at the helm of it, and that's him right here. This is Nurse Rivers, who did the original recruiting for Tuskegee, and other people who had been working on it. Cutler he passed away about 7 or 8 years ago. But if you ever want to hear something that's really poignant, there was a PBS documentary that was done about 10 years ago, just before his death, a couple of years, and he was interviewed, a very lengthy interview on it. And it's fascinating to sit and listen to him, because he didn't feel, even at that point in his life, and the 2000s, he had no kind of apprehension or guilt about it. So the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital, Willowbrook, and the Tuskegee studies proved to be a holy trinity that sparked extensive and critical media coverage and public discussion. They were the ones that were the biggies. There were a lot of other things that were going on too. There was a lot of summary studies or literature reviews that were being done and published in places like Science, and the New England Journal of Medicine, and JAMA, and the like, and talking about things that were going wrong in biomedical research and other research projects. There was one also that was done in Kansas City. It was there was a jury study that was done in the 60s, in which some political scientists and were able to get approval from the courts and also from their university to put microphones in the jury room to listen to jury deliberations. Well, when they published the results, there was a furor that developed American Bar Association and ACLU and that newspaper editors again and the like said that that's actually, that's sanctified ground. And after that, there were laws that were put into place, and so you can never tape a jury room anymore. That was another one of those things that caused pushback. And what are researchers doing? So it wasn't just in biomedical. It was in broad field of research. What are people, there doesn't seem to be any controls in place with what they were thinking. So the Syphilis study, the Tuskegee Impact, led to the National Research Act of 1974, and that you're already familiar with. I know, and then it also led to the Belmont principles, which were published. This was there were a group of specialists, people that had really participated on the Bioethics Commission that put together the National Research Act, that they went into after there was pushback from the research community. What are you looking for in terms of what principles, what philosophical principles should we have that we should be basing our decisions upon? So it went for about a couple of years. They worked at the Belmont Conference Center in Maryland, and went back and forth, and finally published their report in 1979 and came up with the 3 principles that, it's about a 10-page document, the Belmont report, and it's relatively short, but it is very comprehensive. And I've had friends of mine who have been working in this field for years and years, and when I first started out, and they said, really, you'll find everything you need in the Belmont report. Just go back and look at it, and you'll find guidance for almost every situation for it. And it is. I've read it now many, many times, and it's an outstanding document. 3 primary philosophical principles: respect, that's consent, of course, and it's also protecting those who cannot make decisions, like those kids at Willowbrook, and the ones at the Jewish Chronic Disease Center, because these were all debilitated individuals, too. That's one of the major reasons, by the way, the Jewish Chronic Disease Center study, because they tapped into a field in which they were individuals who were suffering from dementia, but also individuals who were in advanced stages of a couple of other diseases, problems. These were individuals who did not have the capacity to judge whether they should be participating or not. And the informed consent that they got was a misleading one on top of that. So that was one of the reasons that people became so upset. Benefits outweigh harms. We spend an enormous amount of that in the review process for an IRB. Maximize benefits, minimize risk. Harm, you're always doing a risk-benefit ratio. You're constantly trying to push down the risk and trying to raise the benefit. Anything that you can find that will make it more beneficial from the participant standpoint, and really from the broader scientific standpoint also. Justice, the burdens and the benefits of the research should be distributed fairly. This has become, it's even called for you. For a long time, you would find that, for instance, women didn't participate or weren't allowed to participate in research, and pregnant women were not allowed, more specifically, to participate in research projects that really should have had that the pregnancy would have had wouldn't have been affected by the research. There were provisions made to make sure that pregnant women, now there are provisions made to make sure the pregnant women who can participate, if there is no good reason for them not to participate. There are provisions for children, provisions for prisoners. There's also more people who have themselves mental disabilities and the like. Students, we have provisions here in our own SOPs, so that students are not exploited here at the university, and which we spent a good amount of time lately putting new SOPs in place for a couple of our departments here at the university. But the point that it comes down to, burdens and benefits of research should be distributed fairly. And I just, in doing some preparation for this talk, I was doing some other back research, and I was finding that It's most biomedical research, 60 to 70%, and some people say it's even more, but the latest figures that I was reading, 60 to 70% of biomedical research is done internationally and in third world countries. And that's a problematic thing because the individuals, for instance, one of the things I was reading about was dermatology studies, creams and things that people use. And before those types of things are done, the research is done in other areas more broadly. And the phase 1 research seems to be done primarily with individuals who are in developing countries. And are they the users of it ultimately? Probably not. And things also like Roundup is another one I was reading an article about, the pesticide. Everybody heard of Roundup? Most of the research that has been done on that has been done in third world countries too, although there was a big scandal in Florida about 2 or 3 years ago. Anybody hear about that? And migrant children were being given doses of Roundup and to see about how, and it caused a huge furor in Florida. Finally, the governor came out and banned such research being done there. And so this was just a couple of years ago. So now we get into something that's very, very significant also because it causes some very, very significant changes in the United States. The radiation experiments that took place in the United States ran from the 30s all the way up to, well, most of it wasn't even, some of it's probably still going on, but most of it ran until the 90s. In 1993, when Bill Clinton came into office, about 2 weeks after he came into office, it was early February 1993, he declares open all of the Atomic Energy Commission records and says there was a FOIA request that was made for them. He signs it. He opens up all of the Atomic Energy Commission records. Of course, there were a lot of people that were in the government and military and that were found that to be abhorrent. When I was reading about the responses of it, I don't know if anybody see the movie Dr. Strangelove? Anybody here? Remember that one scene in Dr. Strangelove when General, what's his name, and he gets up in front of, remember the Russian ambassador comes in, and he tries to put his hands up, George C. Scott is putting his hands up in front of the big board, he's trying to prevent him from seeing it, and and I can only imagine that must have been kind of the response there too, but all of these records are opened up to the public. So, and this was, it says here, the 20th anniversary of the declassification of top secret studies, the human radiation experiments done over 30 years, which the U.S. conducted on as many as 20,000 vulnerable U.S. citizens. Victims included civilians, prison inmates, federal workers, hospital patients, pregnant women. One study I found that took women who were at 3 and 6 months gestation, put them in ribs, and then, of course, had them come back, and then tested the fetus after it, but they were bombarding them with radiation to see how the fetus would, or the infant when it was born, to see how it would have responded. And some of the pictures, some of the things, the descriptions in that are pretty abhorrent. But pregnant women, infants, developmentally disabled children, and military personnel, most of them powerless, poor, sick, elderly. Eileen Welson's 1999 expose, which I highly recommend, and it relates to it here. I just pulled this, just clipped this out, and it shows some of the things that she did. Eileen Welson, she was Denver-based, but she worked for the Albuquerque Tribune, and she ended up winning a Pulitzer Prize for this. And back in '97, I heard her give a talk in New York City back '97, '98, might have been 2000. So she uncovered one of the country's great Cold War secrets, and so she, when she took all of this data, and even though the report had come out, she sat down and went through everything. She was the first journalist, maybe the only journalist that went down and went through all of this data that was offered and that came out, found all kinds of research related, exposed thousands of human guinea pigs, radiation poisoning, and including 18 Americans who had plutonium directly injected into their bloodstreams. 73 disabled children were spoon-fed oatmeal laced with radiation upstate. I could go on. There was a huge list here, and I just clipped that. And that was being treated for a pituitary disorder and injected with it. So she goes on, and here the plutonium files, America's Secret Medical Experiments was the title. So it goes on. This is just the cover page for the final report from the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments. When they opened up all of these files, President Clinton appointed, because there was a lot of requests for what exactly is here, and so they put a report together, and 1995 that came out, and then of course Welson's expose came out after that, and that led to a very, very sobering analysis, of what we are doing and what we do towards it, and how we can let fear so carry away our ethical balance, you might say, or balancing mechanisms, that becomes just, we almost get to the point where we have no limitations within ourselves when fear can become so prevalent. We live in a time right now, here in 2015, in which, that four-letter word of fear is certainly prevalent once again, and around the world. So, moving on, in 2000, this expose comes out. Well, this was a couple of years later, but in 2000, Jesse Gelsinger, anybody heard of the Gelsinger case? Now, hugely important, especially from the standpoint of conflict of interest. All the stuff that you see that's being done on conflict of interest of late relates or goes back to Gelsinger. Jesse Gelsinger was a young man who had himself a genetic affliction, and all you can do is type in Jesse Gelsinger, and believe me, your Google is going to go wacky with 2 million hits on it. But Jesse was 19 years old. He had a very unique genetic affliction. It primarily was problematic for children between the ages of 4 to about 10. So he had himself a very rough period during that period, but he got through it. At 19, he was over the worst of the symptoms, and it was a pretty, he was a healthy, normal young man at that time, living in Arizona. The researcher who was in charge of this was an NIH-funded research project, also funded by private pharma, in collaboration in conjunction with an NIH grant, got Jesse's name from a database. Sent a note to him in Arizona. I think it was Tucson, where he lived, and asking him to join this study, and made it seem like it was, that the risks were minimal and that would be helpful, and it was an advertising brochure essentially. And he, after talking it over with his parents, and his father's a very serious guy. I've met him and heard him give a talk one time, and his father. And after that, he said he wanted to contribute to trying to do something about the disease, so he consented to fly back to Philadelphia. It was being done at Penn, University of Pennsylvania, and went back and got there on a Tuesday, I think it was, and he was dead by Friday. That caused, and this really what this article and this expose in Time really sprang off of him, but it led to an analysis by Time really of what's going on in the rest of the biomedical and other research communities at large too. So, but what happened, the consequences of that are the results from the study that what happened with Jesse. Well, it turned out that the IRB was negligent, for one thing. It wasn't doing what it was supposed to be doing in terms of its review of the protocol. And many informed consent was missing a number of the elements that it should have had. There was deceptive advertising, and we're talking a little bit about that, the recruiting down, and talk about that further on in the talk here. The researcher was misrepresenting the baseline, but it also turns out that Jesse had himself a factor that should have precluded him from being able just immediately, and it was in the preclusion factors, he should not have been able to participate in the study to begin with. And it was overridden by the PI, and he allowed him to come in because they were short of subjects and to come in. And anyway, Jesse, it has severe impact. He goes into traumatic, he has himself a traumatic episode, and he dies on a Friday morning after being there for a couple of days and having taken the genetic therapy. What comes out afterwards, they find out, is that the researcher had $7 million in stock invested in the private company that had been investing in it, and he stood to double his stock taken. If it was successful, it was estimated that he would have had doubling of his stock value, would have been up to $14 million. On top of that, it turns out that the university, and this is what has led to the push for, that one incident kind of triggered the push for institutional conflict of interest. The University of Pennsylvania also had $3 million in its foundation that was in terms of stock in the company that had been funding the research. And that decision was made by the financial offices or within the university. So, and right now we're here at West Virginia University discussing very seriously about how to have ourselves a better institutional conflict of interest policy working on right now. But all of this came out of the Gelsinger study. So, and it's had just some dramatic effects upon the way that by the way, the University of Pennsylvania was shut down for a period, and in the whole IRB and Human Research Protections Office was revamped. And a lot of people were let go, and they repopulated the IRBs and caused a huge ripple effect within the university. The professor himself, the PI, also was suspended for a period of time. He's doing research now, but he was suspended for a significant period of time. University of Pennsylvania settled with the Gelsinger family for an unrevealed amount of money that you can only imagine how much it must have been. And so it has caused huge effects within the community at large in terms of biomedical research. Now, where do we take ourselves? What are the things that we're looking for in terms of what we should be thinking about? I liked it. When I was just starting out in this field, gosh, about 20, 25 years ago, I used to call OHRP, Office for Human Research Protections in D.C., Washington, D.C., and there was a guy that I used to speak with all the time there, and there was also a woman who was also in charge of education at the time there, and they used to say the same thing. When I would ask them about a problem, and they would say, 90% of the time they would come back and they would say, what would a reasonable person in that situation expect in terms of informed consent, in terms of minimization of risk, in terms of whatever you are asking yourself. So reasonable expectations becomes kind of the dictum that you run yourself off of. It kind of takes almost everything. In my opinion, those two words kind of pull everything together from a practical standpoint. You can take all of that we've learned in history lessons and the like. Tuskegee especially, there was in that PBS documentary, there's one line in there in which one of the gentlemen who are still surviving from Tuskegee, and they were interviewing him, and he said, I just can't understand it. And he said, I would not have done to his end what he did to mine, and what he did to me, and what he was implying. The golden rule, and was really exactly what he was aiming at, and that it had just been thrown to the wayside with this. Reasonable expectations, again, kind of the golden rule, and putting it all together. So to kind of summarize then, researcher responsibilities, report to the IRB any adverse events, unanticipated problems, report proposed changes, these amendments that we talked about, And here are the requirements of the IRB. Follow your protocol. Respect the rights of the human subjects. Treat each subject justly. It's like I was talking about in the beginning, the dramaturgical function. Treat people the way that you would like to be treated, and include humans in research likely to be of benefit to the subjects or society. Now, let's talk about recruitment for a while. I need to keep scampering through this. Do we usually take a break in this class, or do we just go? Okay, we're going to go for another half hour here. Recruitment, recruiting subjects, most important, but sometimes can be very, very difficult and time-consuming. Everybody probably in this room knows that. So, and causes all of us to ask ourselves, now where do I go from here? The investigator should determine the feasibility of recruiting subjects prior to accepting a study. The sine qua non consideration process, which happens, must also continue throughout the duration of the trial. Recruitment issues, the most important ones here then, to consider before conducting the study. The time frames, how long is it going to be? How much are you going to be asking people to participate and making sure that they understand it? You should also be thinking about competing studies. What are the likelihood that that's going to, that there are going to be others and you're not going to be able to populate the study the way that you need to? So again, this leads into subject availability. Determining your recruitment strategy, exactly what that is going to be. Gender of subjects that you're looking for. Age range, racial and ethnic origin, if that's something that is required in the project. Recruitment methods, formal referrals, informal word of mouth, health workshops, screenings, health fairs, internet, direct advertising, community meeting places, barbershops, recreation studies, computerized database, charts, record reviews. It's all game. It's all fair, but it also has to be handled judiciously and certainly with a lot of forethought. The initial contact, and this is really important, with the potential subject should be made by those having legitimate access to the information. It's unacceptable to use confidential private data to which the investigator would not ordinarily have access to approach subjects for research study. That's called cold contacting. Right? Has to be an individual. That's why oftentimes it ends up being the person's primary care physician, treating physician, nurse, or whatever, people that they have themselves contact with before they would be making contact with the individual to see if they have an interest in it. There's also, it's unacceptable to use, if they're contacting, it's unacceptable to use, all direct advertising must be reviewed by the IRB. Goes without saying, for the information and mode of communication. Do not state or imply a certainty of favorable outcome or other benefits beyond what is outlined in the consent document and the protocol. Do not be coercive or use undue measures. Do not be misleading to the subjects is most important. Advertising don'ts. No misleading text. No claims of safety, efficacy, equivalence, or superiority. I'm not going to explain those things. Everybody should know what those are in here. No overemphasis on payment. No overstatement of the benefits. The limitations. Name and address of the investigator, purpose of the study, brief description of the requirements, benefits of participation, time commitment, whom to contact for more information. Should not be a huge amount of, you get to the heart of it. Let the individual know what it's about. They will contact you. And rather than promising them the world or free turkeys on Thanksgiving or whatever, but making sure that you stay within the parameters of fairness. Advertising pointers. Avoid acronyms. Place the ad carefully. Advertise frequently. And measure the effectiveness of your advertising. CPRC here in town has been, probably a few of you work at CPRC, don't you? Who's here? Yeah, at least one. But that they've been having themselves quite a bit of success, and I've noticed that I'm noticing that the billboards, the electronic billboard, especially as I go up to Target or go up to Barnes and Noble or something, I see that electronic billboard that has CPRC up there on it. So And I'm sure there are many other places too, but they get to the point. And if people are looking to have some, they'll contact. But it's things that are done carefully too. Payments to subjects, this is enormously important. Payment to subjects for participation is not considered a benefit. It's a recruitment incentive. So you can't put it down as a benefit or in the benefits section. You're really trying to get the person's attention with the money too. You can't put it down and, you know, this is going, in other words, you do not equate it with saying this is going to cure you from whatever disease you have, or, you know, equate it with that. It requires conscientious judgment calls on the part of the researchers and the IRB. But it is not a benefit, and that's the mistake that is made. It's put into the benefits section quite often. People get themselves compensation for their time, or and there might be just also to give them a payment related to the effort that they for their time and for the travel and the like. Those kinds of things are supposed to be. That's what the compensation is supposed to be about. It is not. Again, it is not a benefit. And it will, if you put it in that area, then you're going to find your the protocol, the informed consent will be bounced back. Payment points then. The amount of the payment schedule should be presented to the IRB. Information regarding payments, amount, scheduling of payments must be included in the consent form. Prorated payment systems should be used. People go sequentially through the research study that should be laid out. Payment must not be an undue inducement of the person to participate in the research. It's a quick anecdote. About 10 years ago, we had a study that was done. It was injecting IDU HIV-positive females. It was an NIH-funded study. It was being done in New York City. It was being done in 5 spots, one in each of the boroughs in New York City. And it was aimed at, it was a therapeutic technique, and they were trying to gather sizable subject pools from each of the different, the 5 boroughs. And up in the Bronx, we get a note from, our IRB was the Manhattan portion of the study had to go through our IRB. And there was, I think it was $500 was being paid to the women who were participating in it. And all of it, about 9 months after the study started, 6 months, 9 months, I get a call from the PI, and the PI says, they're dropping out of my, they're dropping out of here in Manhattan, and they're all going over to, or going up to the Bronx. And he said, and the reason for it is that he's raised the $500 up to $750. So there's a contest going on, and then the person out in Queens was talking about raising it to $800 because he had been losing ideas. So you had yourself the old capitalist ethic, and so whatever the market will support, and it was going up. So it came to the IRB. There was a lot of discussion about whether we should put. Whether it was going overboard and it was causing the women to make decisions about to participate, not for reasons of whether they, would be good for them, or they were starting to overlook perhaps the ill sides of the project because it was being, put down. It was almost traveling. It was going up into the area of a benefit. But we had, long story short, there was a large debate about this and about whether we should allow or not allow the PI to be able to raise the compensation to the women. There was this woman who'd been working at the Department of Health, where she had been in charge of the women's supports for the women clinical centers, and a strong feminist advocate for underserved women in New York City for about 20 years. She was an MD, MPH, and she got up and gave a talk and swayed the IRB. She talked for about 20 minutes. Her long story short was that these women get so few benefits, there are so few kind of positives that come their way that that whatever the market supports, these women should be able to draw from it. This is one of the few places that they can do it, and the IRB went along with her. Let them raise to whatever, so whatever the demand is. So it was with the understanding it's just because it was a federal grant, it's not going to be able to go too far anyway. So with that in mind. But I bring that up as an example because we have 5,000 registered IRBs in the United States, approximately. Every one of those IRBs are guided, and it's one of the most important things that I learned early on. They are guided by 45 CFR 46, Title 45, Part 46 of the Code of Federal Regulations. It's a relatively short section of the Code of Federal Regulations, as opposed to HIPAA, which is this, and 45 CFR 46 is about 20 pages, like this. So, and what that meant, this was a very deliberate thing that was done by the National Committee back in the mid-70s. The decision was made at that time to allow, they said, should we try to see if we can foresee any and every possible situation that might occur in research of all types, to see if we could, or do we defer down to set the guiding principles there, the Belmont report in Title 45, and to that, and allow the committee, the committees, where the rubber meets the road, where they're at, to be able to make the most significant decisions. And the latter carry the day. So it's a decentralized system. What that means, when I was referring to the 5,000, you have 5,000 IRBs, and you can have 5,000 different decisions they do for any particular protocol. And you want to have yourself general standards and the like, and there's general consistency, but it does cause people, you hear this all the time, a person coming from one university to the other, and my IRB would never do that. Well, it's not the same situation. It's not, what the feds are not going to be swayed by that. What they're going to ask is, did you give it due process when you were doing it? Was that IRB, did it look at the situation, review the situation with the depth of intensity and seriousness that would allow them, or allow the presumption to be made that they made themselves a wise decision based on the evidence that was presented to them, or whatever. And so that can happen. So the decision that was made within this case that I just talked about can happen anywhere. And the IRBs have that kind of power to be able to do that, but it's for very good reasons. There's a lot of pressure right now within the federal government and to change the what they call the common rule, and to centralize it much more than, and not to leave it in its decentralized way. That's these revisions that they've been talking about for the last couple of years. We'll see where it goes. But we wrote out a position paper here at West Virginia University about 2 years ago when they were asking for that. Okay, so payment points then going on, and I'm going to, I think that's it. I'm coming to the end here, and then I'm going to have you guys let me refer here to this is a study that was done about 5 years ago and came out. It was done, it was published in Nature. It was done by a couple of different, or supported by a couple of different science organizations around the world. The study was Science and Society. There were 20,000, might have been 40,000, I think, participants around the world. And this, I thought, was one of the more interesting conclusions that came out of it. Worldwide, respondents to the Science and Society survey overwhelmingly agreed that scientists are more trustworthy than other public figures, and that investment in science is the key to future well-being and economic growth. There's a lot of tangible worth, really, that and reputation that science brings to the table. That can be, as any person who works in PR can tell you, that can be liquidated very, very quickly. And we've had some reasons to be concerned about science and the reputation of science. There's been some slippage in things like the Harris poll. Its reviews, or it does this professions evaluation. It's every 2 years. And scientists have slipped in the last couple of years in terms of general regard, or what they call very high prestige and high prestige. And scientists for many years were considered to be the highest category in terms of over 300 or 400 professions They do this thing with everybody, plumbers, teachers, social workers, firemen, police, politicians, lawyers. They're all, asked to rate these different occupations. And scientists were always at the top. And you know who's at the top this last year? Yes. Firemen, fire people. What is it? What's the political? Firefighters. So, firefighters now. And second was teachers. And two, scientists are still in the top 5 up there, but they have slipped down a bit. And it's interesting that teachers, which used to be down in category 100, almost up at the top, they're underpaid in the United States, but they're certainly got a lot of prestige, which is interesting. Anyway, science then is that the world has itself a lot of good feelings about science and hopefully we'll be able to maintain that. Takeaway points here today. Don't go anywhere though. We're going to do a little case study here. And science and the exploration dynamic, keep that in mind, just referred to. Reasonable expectations, flexibility. When something is very serious, we should be treating it seriously. When there is research, and there is research being done on just this, on bubblegum flavors here, at the university, that's the kind of thing that goes into an exempt category, a very low-risk category. The dramaturgical function, become the individuals, and always don't forget your responsibility factors that go into research. Now, have any of you heard this and seen it, a research client? No? Then we're gonna take have ourselves a little bit of fun here. And this is an interactive video. Interactive training video educates clinical and social researchers on the importance of appropriately protecting research subjects, avoiding research misconduct. Clinic allows the viewer to assume the role of one of our 4 characters. Determines the outcome of the storyline by selecting decision-making choices as you go through. Each one of the choices ends up with a scenario of about a minute to a minute and a half. And then it goes on and allows you to make other decisions going down the line. You can keep getting into a lot of trouble, or you can get, or you can be good. Personally, I like making the bad choices and see what they come up with. But I was thinking here today that since there are a couple of different, or 4 different people we can choose, but I was thinking, considering the group and research coordinators and the like, that we would go with Jan Klein. Is that okay? So she's the nurse research coordinator for a study. And so